In this video, we're going to be looking at count-controlled loops, and it's part one of iteration. So we're looking at count-controlled loops. So just a reminder of the constructs of an algorithm. We've got these three, which if you remember, the first one is sequence. So all programs have sequence, and it's a set of steps. It's the order that programs run in. Some programs have selection, so it's when they can make a decision. Do I go in left door? Do I go in right door? Do I take door 1? Do I take door 2? Do I take door 3? And the third construct is iteration, where we repeat something. Iteration is where we repeat something. So just a quick reminder, all programs have sequence. But today we're going to be looking at count-controlled loops, and that focuses on iteration. So an iteration statement is a statement which makes the program repeat a set of instructions. Iteration means repeat. Iteration means repeat. So when there's iteration, it's when our program repeats a set of instructions. It repeats a set of instructions. So when we know how many times we would like to repeat an instruction or a block of code, we can use a count-controlled loop. So if we can count how many times we're going to repeat the instruction, we know how many times we're going to repeat the instruction, and we use a count-controlled loop. Or when you want to repeat instructions for a certain number of times, we use a count-controlled loop. Does that give you a big hint into what kind of loop we're going to be looking at? We're going to be looking at for loops. So it's a type of count-controlled loop, which is a type of count-controlled iteration statement. So for loop, when we know how many times we want to repeat an instruction, we use a for loop. So here's a basic pseudocode of what a count-controlled loop looks like. So we've got for, count in range, value, and we've got the instructions that need to be repeated, and then we go to next count. So I'm going to decompose this pseudocode. I'm going to decompose this pseudocode, and I'm going to abstract the important information. So the first piece of abstraction I'm going to be looking at is for. So this initiates a count-controlled loop. So for initiates. Initiate means start. So it starts a count-controlled loop. We then have the word count. So this is a variable, and variables are values that can change. And this variable keeps count. It increments after each loop, and it keeps count. So it's going to be counting our for loop. It's going to be counting how many times these instructions are repeated. We then have the range, and the range defines how many times the instruction will be repeated. And finally, we've decomposed this line into 4 parts, and the last part is the value that determines how many times the loop will loop. It determines how many times the program will loop, and it can be either a number, a range, or a variable, but we'll look at that in a bit. On the next line, we have the instructions or block of code that need to be repeated, and they are indented. We have the instructions or block of code that need to be repeated, and they are indented. Look at that, they're indented because they belong to this for loop. They belong to this for loop. And finally, this is pseudocode. This is pseudocode, so we wouldn't really have this in our program, but it's just letting the reader know that the loop has completed one cycle, and it's going to go to the next count. It's going to go to the next count. And we know that count is a variable that increments. So if it starts at 0, the next count is going to be 1. So now we're going to look at a bit of pseudocode. We've looked at a bit of pseudocode, now we're going to look at some real code. So we can decompose this code, and it is going to be decomposed into the same elements. We've got for, so this initiates a count-controlled loop. And we've got I, and if you remember before, I is a variable that keeps count. So it was called count before, it's called I now, and it's just a variable that keeps count. It's a value that can change. We then have our range, and this defines how many times the instruction will be repeated. And before we wrote this is a value, and in this slide we actually have the value, and that's 5. So this program is going to repeat 5 times. We have the instructions or block of code to be repeated, and they are indented. So there's only one instruction, there's only one block of code that's going to be repeated in this video, in this program. So for I in range 5, print I. Now we're going to take a look at how this code actually works, but just remember, I is a variable name. It's short for index. It could be short for iteration. You could use a different variable name and it would still work. So let's take a look at a for loop trace table. So we're going to actually trace, we're going to look at what happens. So here's our program, and this is just a grab from Python. So we've got for I in range 5, print I. And if we look at what happens when we run that code, it prints I. which is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've got a range of 5, and I is what we're repeating. So if we take a look at the first iteration, so in iteration 1, I equals 0, I equals 0. In iteration 1, I equals 0. And we've printed 0 because the value for I is printed in our for loop. I starts at 0. I starts at 0. So when we're first counting this, I is equal to 0. And we can see that because we print I, and I is 0. On the next iteration, on the second iteration, I is 1, because I increments. So when I loop back again, I's gone from 0, and now it's 1. On our third iteration, I is 2. It goes back up, I becomes 2, and we print 2. On our fourth iteration, I is 3, I is 3. And on our fifth iteration, I is 4, I is 4. So we can see that we've looped it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. In our value here, we said we're going to loop it 5 times, and in our iterations, we've counted it loops 5 times. But I starts at 0, so we even count 0 as one iteration. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what happens is when our for loop reaches 5, when it reaches 5, it stops and it exits the loop. So, just to recap, for I in range 5, print repeat I. So this would print repeat 0, repeat 1, repeat 2, repeat 3, repeat 4, and it would stop at 5. So for loops are useful when you know how many times you want to repeat a block of code. The number in brackets controls how many repetitions there are. The number in brackets controls how many repetitions there are. And the count, or I, increases from 0 to 4, so the loop is repeated 5 times. For I in range 1 to 5, so now we've got a slightly different range. Print I, and it's going to display I on each count. So now that we have 2 numbers there, I is actually going to equal 1 on the first iteration, and will equal 4 on the last iteration. So this is only going to iterate 4 times. The count starts at 1 and ends at 5. Ends at 4, not 5. Weekly G's equals 0. For I in range is 5. We're going to look at a weekly G point calculator. So 4 initiates a count controlled loop. I is a variable that keeps count. And 5 is the number of times it will repeat. So it's a weekly G point calculator. So we don't get G points on Saturday and Sunday. So we only need to calculate it for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, which is 5 days. We're going to input our daily G points. So every day we want to input how many G points that we get. And then we're going to be totaling up how many G points that we get. And after the 5 days, we're going to display or output how many G points we got that week, right? So weekly G points must be declared before the loop starts. Weekly G points must be declared before the loop starts. So if we declare something, we're assigning a value to it, okay? So at the beginning of the week, we have 0 G points. And we need to tell our program, okay, we've got a variable called weekly G's, and it has 0 G points. So 0 is assigned to weekly G's. For I in range, so on my first loop, I'm going to input the number of G points. On my first loop, I'm going to input the number of G points. That number of G points is going to be held in this variable. It's going to be held in this variable, and we're going to add it to our weekly G's. The sum of that will be stored in our variable weekly G. On our second iteration, I'm going to input how many G points I got on Tuesday. That value is going to go here, and it's going to be added to our weekly G's. And that's going to happen 5 times until our weekly G's is output. So printing weekly G's only happens after the loop has completed, because it's not indented. So this is the code that belongs to our for loop. Only once this has repeated 5 times can we print the total G points. So let's take a look at how that runs. There's my code in Python. And I've input the values 5 on the first day, 6 on the second day, 7 on the third day, 8, and then 9. And then it gives me my total G points. And let's have a look. So we've got a slightly larger trace table here because we have more values that we're going to track. So at the first instruction, weekly G equals 0. So there's no loop that's happening here. No loops happened here. Iteration hasn't started. I haven't input any D points. All I know is my weekly G's equals 0. My weekly G's equals 0. Now I'm going to enter the loop. For I in range 5. So once I enter it, I'm in iteration 1. I'm in my first iteration. I starts at 0. Daily G points, so I've input 5 here, so my daily G points now equals 5. And because my weekly G points is 0 to start with, 5 plus 0, 5 plus 0, it's going to equal 5. I'm only on my first iteration, so I need to go back to the top before I print anything, so nothing goes in here. Now, on my second iteration, I can see that I'm going iteration, and I've input 6. So I'm repeating this line of code. I've input 6. So daily G's is 6. Weekly G's is currently 5. So I'm going to add 6 to 5, which gives me 11. So these weekly G's are now 11. And what I'm doing is I'm just adding, and weekly G's is a running total. So what's going to happen on my third iteration? I'm going to input 7. My third iteration, I is now equal to 2. 7 is input to daily G's, and 7 plus 11 equals 18. On my next iteration, so iteration 4, I is equal to 3. Daily G points, I input 8. 8 plus 18 gives me 26. And finally, on my fifth iteration, I is equal to 4, so I is still in the range of 5. I input 9. 9 plus 6 is equal to 35. Now, I go back up, and I becomes 5, so it's actually no longer in range. So I exit my for loop, and I print total points. So the iteration is now over. I remains as 4, daily G's remains as 9, but what's happening is I'm printing my total. I'm printing what my weekly G points are. So quite a lot of information in that video. Just to finish off with, make sure you remember iteration is when instructions repeat. Iteration is when instructions repeat, and when you want to count how many times your instructions are repeated, you use a for loop.